Hey students, thanks for checking out our channel and walking with us through the Gospel of John. Today we're going over John 6. Like in the past, I want to give you some time to read the chapter, so pause the video now if you need to. Awesome. John 6 is the famous story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Many know this story and know how Jesus took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and fed a huge crowd of 5,000 people. And this story is an awesome representation of the power of Jesus, and there are 2 big points that you should take away from this story. Number 1, Jesus is the true bread that supersedes the bread of the Passover. And then number 2, Jesus was sent from the Father and is capable of giving eternal life. What does that mean that Jesus is the true bread? Just like we've talked about before, the story of the Jewish people go back in time to the time of the Exodus. Or the Passover is also what it's called. So anytime you hear about the Passover festival, it's remembering this time and the Exodus. In that time, God saved the people and took them to the promised land. He took them out of Egypt and into the promised land. On that journey, the people were hungry and complaining, and God provided manna for them. This manna was a bread-like substance that the Lord used to feed the people for 40 years. And when Jesus comes into the scene in this time, he feeds the people. And they directly correlate this to their ancestors. And just like their ancestors, the Jews in this story chose to murmur amongst themselves rather than believe in God. And if they chose to believe in Jesus, they would have been saved, but they still didn't understand who he was or even anything about him after this miracle. A cool note is that there were 12 baskets left over after this miracle. And while it's debated, 12 tended to represent the 12 tribes of Judah and the 12 disciples. And so at the end of this story, we see that in verse 14 it says, "When the people saw this sign that he had done, they said, 'This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world.'" Here the people saw Jesus as the second Moses, because he performed a sign in a similar miracle as Moses did. If you're a part of our study through Exodus, you know that Moses predicted that a prophet would come that would be like him. And Jesus is that prophet. But he's not just like him, he's actually greater than Moses. He's Moses 2.0. They looked to make him king as well because they wanted to revolt against Rome. They knew that when they see the Messiah, when they see this prophet, like we talked about before, then he had come to lead a rebellion, or that's what they thought. But Jesus didn't want that, because that is not why Jesus came. He was not the leader that they assumed he would be. So he left and he came back later. And instead of being caught up in this title or idea of political power, Jesus chose to go by himself to be with the Lord. He took time alone with God to be with him, which is something that we should emulate. And oftentimes we get distracted or think that there's something more important. Especially in this time, you should take time to be with Christ and focus on him because you have time and opportunity to do so. Later in the story, we see that the people truly did not believe because in verse 30, they asked Jesus for another sign to prove who he is. Prove it, if you will. They were not content in what God had already provided, and rather they were looking to be consumers and see what Jesus would give them. And how often are we too in this position where we come to Jesus wanting something or telling him to move or do something rather than just accept and believe due to the gifts that he's already provided and given us? Jesus would go on to make big statements in the story. From verse 35, where he says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Then he says in verse 51, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." So what do these statements mean? Is Jesus promoting cannibalism? No. He's saying that if the people look to him, he will satisfy their spiritual hunger. Many of us will often look to food to fulfill our physical hunger. When we're hungry, we want to eat. And similarly, we tend to look for something to fill us spiritually. Only Jesus can fulfill this desire that we have, and he is ultimately what matters. Jesus is saying this to refocus our thoughts on him and for us to realize that all this material stuff that's around us and on earth will pass away, but God and his word will remain. Thanks for checking out our Bible study, and I hope you'll stay healthy and have a great day. See you guys.